Small sports cars used to be all the rage in the 70s and the 80s. We had the MGB, we had the Fiat X19, the Fiat Spider, the Lotus Elan. Then something terrible happened. VW brought out the Golf, specifically the Golf GTI. And by the early 80s, everyone was scrambling to pension off their old little sports cars and just put GTI badges on their normal range. In 1989 though, the MX5 was released, and that surprisingly was a smash hit. It woke most manufacturers to the potential of this type of car. Rover's first reaction was to produce the RV8, a car based on the original MGB, a design that goes back to the 60s and 70s. It retained a solid rear axle and leaf springs. A car of that type was never really going to break the mold in the 90s. Eventually though, they managed to scrape together enough money to make a brand new mid-engined convertible. It was quite a special little thing in many ways, the hydrogas suspension which harked back to the original Mini, and for Rover, in such difficulties at the time, to come out with a clean sheet design was pretty impressive. There were two versions of this. The original MGF came out in 1995, but it was criticised for not really being sharp enough. That's both in looks, also the quality of the interior and the way it drove. The hydrogas suspension perhaps was a little bit too refined for this type of car. The one we have here is the T, so the TF. It came out in 2002. You can see it's been updated all round. Let's take it out for a drive. I'll tell you more about that and we'll find out how it goes. So there's a little bit more to this update than I hinted at. It wasn't just that the hydrogas suspension was replaced with standard units, but also the chassis was strengthened. That may be because obviously having the really pliant original soft suspension meant that chassis stiffness wasn't quite as important. Now that they had proper coil springs and so on and dampers, that was more of a thing, but 20% of increased rigidity. When they were first tested, it was acknowledged that the new car made for a sportier drive, which was welcome. What was less welcome is that you went from the incredible cassetting suspension of before to something that was probably a little bit overly stiff. This car though, being one of the last produced before Rover went bankrupt in 2005, had another minor update and had a comfort suspension pack. So by most measures, it's considered the best of both worlds. Let's see how it feels through the gears. I'm actually quite impressed so far, not so much by how quick it is, but how well it's handling this road. Let's go back to the engine. In the updated car, you had, I think, a 1.6 which had 115 horsepower, the 1.8 with 135, and a 160 horsepower version. This one is the 135 with the much maligned Rover K series. As in other applications, most notably the Elise, it suffered from head gasket failure, and that's a shame. That was just due to cost cutting really, using gaskets that weren't sufficient or the installation wasn't properly done. The engine themselves are a brilliant design. As you could see there, it pulls all the way to 7,000 with a little rush towards the end, which is just lovely. My own Elise has a very similar K series, and in this car, it's much more muted. In terms of engine sound, you wouldn't call it exciting, but it has the same eager feel. Gearbox is really nice. I think Lotus could have learnt a thing or two from that. The application in the Elise, same engine after all, mid-engine car, same location, is nowhere near as nice as this. It's maybe a little bit more precise with the upgrade I've put in on it, but otherwise, it has a bit of a rubbery feel. That's the only thing that I would say. More mechanical would be nice. Driving position as well. I was expecting it to be a bit more of an issue for me, being quite tall. And I can just feel the air skimming over my head, but it's not too bad. My left leg is just touching the console there, so that's a little bit annoying. But overall, for a small sports car, I think the driving position is pretty good. The steering, similarly, I think is lovely. I've heard it said in the past that it's a little bit overly light, but I don't think so. It's a mid-engine, small, light car. That's what you get. It feels pretty unfettered to me. Now, the Elise has zero inertia. That's one of the beautiful things about that car. Nothing quite compares to it in that way. This, whilst not being the same, reminds me of that. There's just very little residual weight that moves around when you're braking or when you're changing direction. It feels like a pretty well sorted little car. The interior has been much maligned and it does feel a little bit cheap. I mean, you've got to think that this was a competitor. At that point in time, it would have been a Mark 1 MX5. No, when it came out, it was probably a Mark 2, which was a little bit improved. This does feel a little cheaper. I think the plastics on this center console in particular. The steering wheel is nice. It's the right sort of size. Instruments are clear, but again, they don't exactly reek of quality. One thing, actually, which does reek of quality and really stands out is this switchgear. The stalks look and feel lovely. That's because they are a relic of Rover's relationship with Honda. So don't forget this, the design of this was all done, although it was released when BMW already bought them, the design goes back to the day when they were still part of British Aerospace and they had this agreement with Honda. They were using a lot of their technology. It's such a shame that they didn't carry on with that. Perhaps Honda would have ended up being a better match. For a mid-engine sports car though, this is where it should excel. And let's see how it feels. It dealt with that pretty well, although the front end was going a bit light by the end of the corner. Let's just go through it again the other way. You really do have to rev it to get the best out of it. It's not a particularly torquey feeling. 1100 kilos this weighed, which is pretty good. The brakes are being criticised. They feel fine to me on this car, but you can see they are quite small discs, so perhaps under repeated use they wouldn't be all that great. Pretty secure feeling for a mid-engine car. Today we've had a little bit of a drizzle, so I think the road is slightly greasy. Perhaps some of the communication, the feedback that you get is a little bit more muted than I would have liked. I think a Gen 3 MR2 gives you back a little bit more feedback, but all the same, it's a really well-judged little chassis. I guess the trade-off of having a little bit of a cramped interior is that the car is small, but it also shrinks around you on these lanes. So you can place it more accurately. You don't have to worry so much about oncoming traffic. It just makes for a more relaxed experience on our country roads. Now this car is a bit of a jewel because it only has 15,000 miles. It belongs to Paul, who is another fellow YouTuber. Do check him out. The channel is called Paul's Yard. I will put the link in the video description, but it's just been great to be able to drive one which is such a faithful representation. It's not modified, it's just low mileage, it's exactly as it was. So overall, could be shocking that a British product is good, but it really is a good car. And indeed, overall, I think 77,000 just of the MGFs were sold. In Britain, it was the best-selling car, well, best-selling open-top car for years. And when this one came out, the TF, altogether between 2002 and 2010, It sold another 40,000 units. So what's that? We're looking at 120,000 produced, which is pretty good. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I also think that this should be celebrated as the last of the mass-produced British sports cars. Has anything else been done since? I know we have Lotus. It's not really mass-produced though, is it? In terms of the cheap, smaller sports cars, the Elite I don't think counts. TVRs likewise, not mass-produced. Ever since then, I don't think there's been anything else like this. It's nice but sad at the same time that the last one that was made was a great car. One area I suppose that I'm not wholly convinced by is the looks. In a way, I quite like the jelly mold original. It suited the fact that it's a little bit slab-sided. The update does sharpen it up. In some ways it looks better, but I'm still not 100% convinced by it. But I guess if you look at MX5, although the first was beautiful, the Gen 2 that this was competing against was also a little bit not too sure about. And the same with the Toyota MR2. That wasn't exactly a beautiful design, probably the worst out of the three. Thank you all so much for watching, it's hugely appreciated. Just one last ask before you go, if you can, do please sign up to my Facebook page. I'll put the link in the comments. Thank you so much, see you for the next video.